Trinitarians. It's a pleasure to be with you once more, and this is our penultimate session on lost and forgotten Christian communities. Now, today we're going to be talking about a church that I would say is neither lost nor forgotten. That's the Church of Byzantium, and there's so much evidence within church writings and archaeology and remaining church buildings that survives to just show how grand and important this particular church, or the Church of the Eastern Roman Empire, was. Now, this church survives through to this day. We often will refer to the Eastern Orthodox Church or the Greek Orthodox Church, and that's coming out of this particular frame of the Eastern Roman Empire. A number of you are probably more aware of this part of Eastern Church history than perhaps some of the other examples that we've looked at on this series. And I would imagine that a number of you have traveled also to places in Anatolia or Turkey, Asia Minor, which is where we're going to spend all of our time today. And today I want to talk about two parts of the Byzantine Church, two quite contrasting parts, though both have left an extremely powerful legacy on the church worldwide. The first is I want to talk about a particular Christian Roman family that lived in Cappadocia or Pontus, a region just south of the Black Sea. And secondly, to end our time looking at the churches really in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, I thought it would be appropriate to look at the Church of Churches, Hagia Sophia. So what contrasts these two examples is the family that I'm going to talk about is really, even though they're wealthy, they're really all about a life of asceticism and service to the church. Contrasting in some ways with that, of course, is Hagia Sophia, which is not only a shining, shimmering example of God's glory on earth, but it's also a sign of empire, something that some of the Cappadocians might have pushed back against a little bit, at least in terms of the expression of power that's there. Although I'm sure there's an argument to be made otherwise. Just as a reminder, by around 380 or so, when Theodosius makes Christianity the official religion of Rome, Christianity by that point is probably the majority religion. So as you can imagine, the religion of the empire brings with it certain social and economic benefits to those that then call themselves Christians. And as you might expect, there are then some Christians in this setting of not only toleration, but state sanction that start pushing against what this means socially and economically for Christians. And they start retreating from politics and retreating quite famously to deserts and to portions of Syria. So I'm thinking of examples like Antony of Egypt and Simeon the Stylite, who set up some of our first examples of solitary monks. One other kind of monasticism, the monasticism that we in the West are most familiar with, or communal monasticism, really begins in Armenia. A lot of things seem to come from Armenia to the northeast of Turkey. And one of the particular families that we're going to spend a little bit of time with today is influenced by this Armenian example of communal monasticism. So this desire not to retreat from society, but to live a life of sacrifice and deprivation, but to do so for service of the church, for service of the poor. And there are three men, two of whom are brothers, that we refer to today as the Cappadocian Fathers. So the Cappadocian Fathers of the mid-4th century, so they're the generation immediately after the Council of Nicaea, which really established that Christ is a part of the Godhead. He wasn't created by God the Father. He's co-equal and co-eternal. And so these three men are really a part of the vanguard of theologians that continue to fight against Arianism, that would argue against the co-eternality and co-equalness of Christ. And now those three men are St. Basil of Caesarea, St. Gregory of Nyssa, and St. Gregory of Nazianzus. And these three men say of particular cities because those are the cities in Turkey where they were bishops. Two of these men are actually brothers, St. Basil and St. Gregory of Nyssa. And the region of Turkey that they live in and around is Cappadocia. And many of you have probably seen images of this. I would imagine that some of you have actually been there. On the left is an image of a rock-cut church, which is after the 4th century, as is most of the Monks Valley. But this gives you a sense of the kind of space and grandeur. And again, similar to how we saw the catacombs under Rome in the first week, the monk cells and these churches are hewn out of very soft volcanic rock. So what's interesting about these Cappadocian Fathers, apart from what they're really rightly known for, which is the protection of orthodoxy, according to the First Church Council, the Nicene Council, is the family rather, and some of the women that were behind the training of and the lives of St. Basil and St. Gregory. So here's a family portrait. This is incredibly impressive. So this is St. Basil and St. Gregory of Nyssa's family. You'll notice there's a woman, Macrina, at the top. So these two church fathers, Cappadocian Fathers, are 2 of 10 children born to Basil and Emilia from Cappadocia. And eventually, these parents of this generation of 10 children become sainted as well. So today the church knows them also as St. Basil and St. Emilia. The Cappadocian Father, St. Basil, will differentiate and we'll probably just call him St. Basil the Great. They're a wealthy Roman family. They own property in the Roman province of Pontus, which is off of the Black Sea. They also owned land in Armenia. The previous generation, so the grandparents of the generation of 10 children, the grandparents actually, one of the grandfathers is actually martyred. All of his wealth and property is stripped. And so this is one of the continuing themes in this family, is they say, despite our constant giving over of possessions for the ministry of the church, despite our grandfather having been martyred and stripped of his possessions under Diocletian, God continues to provide us with wealth through which we can bless the church and the poor. And this is a continuing theme we see. They had a grandmother whose name is also Macrina, who's also now called a saint, and she was a disciple of a really famous 2nd, 3rd century churchman, also named Gregory. His name is actually Gregory, the Wonder Worker, referred to colloquially. 3 of the brothers in this generation, so Basil, Gregory, and one of their other brothers, are bishops. 2 other brothers were monks, one of whom, Peter, is going to work with one of the sisters, Macrina, to set up a monastery. And it's Macrina the Younger, as she's known, that we want to sit and learn from for a little while here this morning. So Macrina the Younger, we know what we know about her thanks to her brother, her younger brother, Gregory of Nyssa, and what he wrote, both also in her life of Saint Macrina, as well as in a dialogue he recorded that they supposedly had when she's on her deathbed. And that dialogue is referred to on The Soul and the Resurrection. And you can find English translations of both of these. This particular icon on the screen I especially love because it shows her holding an icon in an icon of her 3 brothers, Basil, Gregory, and Peter, the 3 bishops. You'll notice they're holding their hands in the symbol of the Trinity. So Father, Son, the incarnation coming down, God coming down to earth, and then the Holy Spirit. And it's a sign of blessing for the church. So Macrina is born in 327, so 2 years after the Council of Nicaea. She's 12 when her father dies. And at that time, she had been engaged to a fiancé who also suddenly dies. And this isn't unusual for a young woman from a wealthy Roman family to be engaged so early in her life, right? The marriage would happen later, and it's a way of setting up sort of alliances and reputation. And I think really the key to understanding the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire is really to understand these powerful Roman families that hold so much of Roman history in their hands. After her fiance dies, she goes to her parents. So her fiance dies before her father. And she goes to them and says she's never going to marry. She's going to dedicate her life to God and to a life of asceticism, and she's going to become her mother's permanent companion. She becomes known upon her father's death as a teacher, companion, a kind of father and guide to a number of her brothers. Early on, she lives a really disciplined life of reading the Psalms every day, of physical manual labor like spinning, and she also works to convince her mother to turn their house into a monastery because she wants everything to be held in common, all goods to be held in common, with their maids, their servants, and any slaves. And when her mother actually dies in 370, Macrina gives away all of her possessions and lives the rest of her life in her house as a monastery, living side by side with former servants and former slaves. This is a woman to be reckoned with, right? She knows her mind early on. Believes she's tasked by the Holy Spirit to live this sort of life of servant, and she goes about doing this. She's also the older sister in that she's not afraid to tell her brothers what she thinks and to set them down a peg. And one of the beautiful examples of this is a quote from Life written by Gregory, but it's about his older brother Basil the Great. And this is what Gregory says, kind of one sibling says about another sibling behind the sibling's back. This is what Gregory says happened when Basil comes back from studying rhetoric in the center of philosophy in Athens. And this is how Macrina greets him and treats him. Although when she took him in hand, he was monstrously conceited about his skill in rhetoric, contemptuous of every high reputation, and exalted beyond the leading light of the province by his self-importance. So swiftly did she win him to the ideal of philosophy. This is philosophy as a way of life, a way of asceticism, a Christian philosophy, that he renounced worlds, showed contempt for the admiration of rhetorical ability, and went over of his own accord to this active life of manual labor, preparing for himself by means of his complete poverty a way of life that would tend without impediment towards virtue. In this way, we can also see, if you're interested in philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, that the family is very influenced by ideas of Plato. While humbling her brother, Macrina also worked with her mother during her lifetime, and then with her bishop brother Peter to feed populations in the part of landlocked Turkey where they lived, feed population during times of famine. And Macrina and her brother Peter are the ones that actually start two monasteries, one for men and one for women. In particular, Macrina took in young orphan girls and structured their life around prayer and housework and a simple diet. And she lives in the same place until 379, which is the same year that Basil the Great dies. She dies as well. Macrina's life, as written about by her brother, emphasizes her asceticism for the good of the community she formed and the fact that she chose celibacy. To reject marriage and childbearing in Roman society was to reject the primary value and function of women as the vehicle for furthering this all-important Roman family. I mean, we know that Romans, pagan Romans, right, prayed to their ancestors. Cannot overemphasize enough how important intergenerational Roman families are. The reason why female Christian celibates are also often persecuted and sneered at in the Persian army is for similar reasons, right? Childbearing is so valued that if you willingly give that up, and it's tied to particular religious reasons, it makes you a symbol of derision. In addition, Gregory shows her to be a teacher of Socratic-like dialogue in this On the Resurrection and the Soul. On the contrary, Basil does not mention his sister or any of his other sisters, but historians are really free with ascribing her a significant role on his thinking and growth as well. In fact, Macrina is one of so many women in the classical and medieval periods of Christian history who took to life in monasteries. In the West, we're more familiar with figures like Catherine of Siena, Hildegard of Bingen, and Julian of Norwich. Of course, there is this strong thread throughout the history of Christianity of women who are recognized and respected as spiritual leaders and authorities. And evidence can be found of male church leaders saying that women are not only serving other women, but they're serving the church overall as voices of authority. For instance, Theodoret of Cyrus wrote of another solitary female, or of a solitary female ascetic, Domina, that, quote, virtue cannot be separated into male and female, for the difference is one of bodies, not of souls. There is neither male nor female. And that argument of virtue not being tied to a particular sex is one that is beleaguered and dogged the church, especially in the ways in which we have sometimes been tied to Aristotelian tradition, less so with the Platonic tradition. But there are plenty of examples that we see throughout the early church and the medieval church of women teaching men and sustaining the church with the goal of common life together in the hope of resurrection. The image that you see on your screen is of a 4th century, of course that's a much later building, but it's a 4th century monastery in northern Turkey as well, not particularly tied to the Cappadocian Fathers or this family, but I loved it because it gave you an image, and the monastery that we're talking about no longer exists. So on her deathbed, Gregory is with her, and she prays this prayer, and she's lying on a plank on the floor with her head supported by another wood plank. And this is what St. Gregory tells us she said. You have released us, O Lord, from the fear of death. You have made the end of life here on earth a beginning of true life for us. You let our bodies rest in sleep in due season, and you awaken them again at the sound of the last trumpet. You entrust to the earth our bodies of earth, which you fashioned with your own hands, and you restore again what you have given, transforming with incorruptibility and grace what is mortal and deformed in us. You redeemed us from the curse and from sin, having become both on our benefit. You have crushed the heads of the serpent who had seized man in his jaws because of the abyss of our disobedience. You have opened up for us a path to the resurrection, having broken down the gates of hell and reduced to impotence the one who had power over death. You have given to those who fear you a visible token, the Son of the Holy Cross, for the destruction of the adversary and for the protection of our life. And that's about half of her prayer. I think in that you can see a number of common themes with some of the other primary sources that we've been reading throughout this series. In particular, I think of Ephraim's harrowing of hell, and there continues to be this theme in the Eastern Church of hell being destroyed, fearlessness of death, a real derision towards death through the resurrection and the power of the resurrected Christ. So what about the rest of the family? Well, very quickly, I'm not going to beleaguer this because we are talking about Macrina, but the rest of the family goes on to serve the church. And one piece that I think is particularly interesting, St. Basil, in addition to his theologizing and his protection of the church in that way, is that, like the rest of his family, he's totally given over to this life of service to the poor. And he actually is often credited with starting one of the first hospitals. And here you can see a quote by his friend and fellow Cappadocian Father, Gregory Nazianzus, and he says, "In the Basileid Hospital, we see people whom everyone rejected and hated because of their illness, and Basil the Great managed to convince us that if we consider ourselves humans, we cannot neglect our own kind, for with our heartlessness and wickedness we offend Christ himself, who is head of all." What was distinctive about these hospitals is that they were set up in such a way that patients could stay in the facility for the duration, for the entirety of their treatment. They had trained medical professionals, what we would refer to as doctors and nurses today, who would be able to diagnose and provide treatment for patients, and the hospital did not charge because so many of their patients are either monks or the poor of the area that weren't able to support themselves in time of need. And so this tradition, I think, of caring for the body as well as the soul, right? We see in Christ's life, we see in his miracles of physical healing, and we see here early on in the very early history of parts of the Eastern Church. The other piece of this is how much Christianity and faith is a multi-generational family affair that really comes out with this extraordinary example. And now to turn to something quite different. I guess you could call the theme of today, so what has Byzantium ever done? Well, on your screen is one of the most fabulous things that the Byzantine Empire ever did, which is the building of Hagia Sophia, the church there that of course was a mosque for a number of, I guess, roughly 500 years, from 1453 until just around World War I. And now, of course, today it's a museum. Today, when we travel to Istanbul, we are still stunned by the size and the dominance of Hagia Sophia as it rises out of the old city that was Constantinople. Even the mosques in the city quite close by that have been modeled on it struck me when I was there in 2005 as still sort of shadows of the greatness of this old church. In the first 4 centuries, there had been churches of significance centered on the holiest sites of Christianity, such as in Jerusalem or Bethlehem and Rome. And there have been churches of significance due to where they were with the rapidly growing congregations and their tie to apostles, such as those in Alexandria, and of course the church in Edessa and its tie to Thomas. But Hagia Sophia, this particular building itself, was built in the early 500s on the orders of Emperor Justinian, and it dwarfs and surpasses all other churches. Justinian was named a successor of his uncle Justin in 527, and shortly thereafter he faces a rebellion in the capital city of Constantinople, led by a group known as the Greens and Blues, and this particular group of people were in charge of the entertainment of the Hippodrome. They appointed the nephew of another former emperor as the new nephew, and they basically set about burning most center of the old city of Constantinople, right, which was at least 200 years old by that point. They chanted Nika, which is Greek for conquer, and one of the places they also burn is the old Constantinian church, also known as Hagia Sophia. What to do in this moment of crisis? Well, really famously, it appears to be Justinian's wife, Theodora, who is another formidable woman to be reckoned with. History, in terms of how historians have written about her, has not always been kind, but she's very, very strong and very much a force behind his power. She convinces him, don't flee, don't negotiate, use force. And so the troops enter the Hippodrome, and a massacre ensues. So what prompted or necessitated the rebuilding of the Church of Hagia Sophia is, of course, one of these imperial moments of power. Plans to rebuild emerged immediately. The church is built in 5 years, which is, when you compare that to some of the buildings of some of the cathedrals in medieval Europe, is staggeringly quick. Justinian always seems to be motivated with a kind of one-upmanship, and there's a wealthy woman elsewhere in Anatolia that had built a magnificent church recently, and so he seems to want to outdo her. The central focus, as you can see, of this church is the dome, which is 31 meters in diameter, or 101 feet, and the height of it is 55 meters, which is just over 180 feet tall. Now, to give you a sense of perspective, the interior of St. Paul's in London, the dome is the same diameter, and that's built in the 17th century. And the interior dome height of St. Paul's is 69 meters. So this is not quite, this isn't as high as St. Peter's, but you're talking about 1,000 years separating when these two churches were built. Hagia Sophia, in terms of its interior space, still ranks in the top 20 of world churches as the largest, and most of the churches on that list were built from the 14th century onwards. Well, all of them are built from the 14th century onwards, most of them in the 1800s. This church is built by 2 engineers, Anthemius and Isidore of Miletus. Well, one was, the first is a mathematician who's interested in conic structures, ellipses, and mirrors, so reflective spaces. And Isidore himself was a professor of geometry and mathematics, and he's interested in inscribing solids in other solid shapes, in vaulting, and in the design of a special compass for the drawing of parabolas. The support for the dome, that high and that large, under which you can see there's windows, there are 40 of those windows, gives the appearance, when you're inside, that the dome is just floating. Prior to Hagia Sophia, most churches had taken on a basilica plan that's like along a long, narrow hall. So they basically took over what had been imperial reception halls, put an altar at the east end, and made that into the structure of the church. Hagia Sophia feels different. So it still has a long and narrow feeling, but it feels a little bit more like a square than a rectangle. And this is too small with some of the writing for you to see well, but the red arrow is pointing to the west entrance, which was the imperial entrance. The green arrow is pointing to the east end, where today they've uncovered a mosaic of the Virgin and Child, and I'll show you that in a minute. And then the blue is, I overlaid that directly over the size of the dome. To the bottom and the top of the screen, within the large footprint of the church, you can see that there's a north and a south gallery. So the space that's open is mostly the space immediately surrounding what's underneath the dome, and then more to the west and the east of that. If you were to sit on this image for a while, you would see that it's overlaid with both Islamic contributions when it was a mosque and earlier Christian introductions. So there's a baptistry there as well, and it is now surrounded by small mausoleums in the exterior of the property for particular Ottoman sultans. And this is an image of the imperial entrance looking to the far east end. Prior to Hagia Sophia, most churches had been taken on the basilica plan, as I said. But the dome of the Pantheon in Rome, we might say, well, that is somewhat similar, but it's not used, that idea wasn't used generally east of the Mediterranean, and that dome is actually less than half the height of Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia introduced a design and a decorated space that merged the high and massive dome with a central hall, plus gold mosaics, silk hangings, silver discs, and lights everywhere, and marble that seems to move, which you can sort of see to the right of that doorway there. There's some pretty exceptional marble there with waves and designs, natural waves and designs in it. Today, the interior of Sophia is a mixture of Christian and Islamic imagery. However, imagining the space for worship in the 6th century until the 15th century, when it became a mosque, is helped by further scholarship that's been done today, as well as just by considering what the space is like. In the 6th century, a few decades after it had been built, there were cracks that started to appear, and so Justinian had it raised 7 meters high, made it narrower, better supported, and on the occasion of its rededication, one of his court officials that today we know as Paul the Silentiary wrote an extensive poem. At the conclusion of his stunning description, he refers to Hagia Sophia's ever-changing aspect. And I think that's really absolutely true from my experience. So what you see here is at the east end, what has been uncovered, a fabulous mosaic of Madonna and Child. And then this is one of the mosaics. It's 13th century, so it's relatively young compared to some of the others that I wanted to show you. But this is where I was standing in Hagia Sophia. It's in one of the, I believe it's in the northern gallery. It had just stopped raining and the sun was streaming through onto this gold mosaic, and the whole thing just moved and shimmered, and it literally took my breath away. And I have been in a number of cathedrals in Europe and seen the most fantastic stained glass windows, and the windows at Canterbury for us Anglican types. Those are amazing, but there's nothing that I've experienced that comes close to the movement and the changeable expression of these magnificent Byzantine mosaics. So what I'm going to do now is just scroll through a few pictures with some of Paul, the court official's descriptions next to them. And this is just a close-up of that mosaic. That mosaic, you will have noticed Mary and then John the Baptist. Upon the carved stone wall, curious designs glitter everywhere. The joining of the cut marbles resembles the art of painting, for you may see the veins of the square and octagonal stones meeting so as to form devices. Connecting in this way, the stones imitate the glories of painting. Yet who, even in the thundering strains of Homer, shall sing the marvel meadows gathered upon the mighty walls and spreading pavement of the lofty church? Mining tools of toothed steel have cut these from the green flanks of Carcetus and have cleft the speckled Phrygian stone, sometimes rosy mixed with white, sometimes gleaming with purple and silver flowers. There is a wealth of porphyry stone too, besprinkled with little bright stars that had laden the riverboat on the broad Nile. You may see the bright green stone of Laconia and the glittering marvel with wavy veins found in the deep gullies of Iasian peaks, exhibiting slanting streaks of blood red and livid white, the pale yellow with swirling red from the Lydian headland, the glittering crocus-like golden stone which the Libyan sun, warming it with its golden light, has produced on the steep flanks of the Moorish hills. Before one comes to the glitter of cut mosaic, the mason, weaving together with his hands thin slabs of marble, has figured upon the wall connected arcs laden with fruit, baskets, and leaves, and has represented birds perched on boughs. Such ornament surrounds the beauteous church. And above the high crested columns, underneath the projecting stone edge, is deployed a tapestry of wavy acanthus, a wandering contexture of spiky points, all golden, full of grace. It encompasses marble, shields, discs of porphyry glittering with a beauty that charms the heart. Countless other lights hanging on twisted chains does the church of ever-changing aspect contain within itself. Some illumine the aisles, others the center or the east and west. Others shed their bright flame at the summit. Thus the bright night smiles like the day and appears herself to be rosy ankled. I think this poem echoes passages of scripture in which the Temple of Solomon is described. And perhaps he wrote it with that in mind, all of these places around the empire and beyond where these precious stones and marbles are gathered. And in fact, that this space is seen as the most significant and most important of church structures. As far as worship, the central nave of Hagia Sophia would only be used once or twice a week. And for major feast days, the imperial entrance is where the emperor, of course, and the empress walk in, holding the elements for the Eucharist. And the liturgy of the Byzantine Church used that liturgy that had begun in Antioch. So they're in the Antiochian liturgical tradition, passed down through the work of St. John of Chrysostom, as well as sometimes using the liturgy, the anaphora of none other than St. Basil of Caesarea, this Cappadocian Father. So recently, scholars led by a team at Stanford have worked to understand what it would have actually sounded like in the specific space of Hagia Sophia with its marbles, its mosaics, and its vastness of its cavities. In her article, one of the lead scholars has argued that the medieval viewer wanted to see the presence of the spirit in what is essentially changing of appearances of matter, such as glitter and shadow. As Gregory of Nyssa stated, sense perception is a means of teaching the spiritual. So Hagia Sophia's interior presents a kind of synergy between two forces that produce the effect of animation. So first, she says there's an imaging power of the forms and the materials, such as columns and the waves in the marble. And second is the way in which light and sound hit these marble surfaces and they seem to move. Faced with this, the viewer simultaneously could conjure images of quivering water based on his or her perceptual experience, as well as concepts of the Holy Spirit and the whispering of God. Even the added sounds of people, cloth brushing, hanging silk tapestries, and curtains added to the whisper of the breath of the Spirit, as this church of all churches was enlivened and changed through sunlight, moonlight, candlelight. So this is our last week being fully immersed in the churches east of the Mediterranean, or on the eastern portion of the Mediterranean. And so I wanted to share with you, and to end, a short immersive film from this group of scholars in which you'll see images of Hagia Sophia and hear short readings in Greek from Paul the Silenciary's poem. The chant that you're actually going to be hearing is from a group called Capella Romana, and that is based on work that this team of scholars did. They went into Hagia Sophia, they popped a balloon and recorded it and studied it, and then they recorded one of a number of pieces, but the one we're going to be listening to today is actually a canticle refrain written by St. Basil of Caesarea. I hope then you'll join me next week for our final session, in which I consider the Black Death of the 14th century and the churches of the West, as well as cultures of the East that first encountered sort of the plague to beat all plagues. So here in ending is some phenomenal Byzantine chant with images of Hagia Sophia today.